Why did you decide to publish it?
So it's not often that there aren't many writers like Richard who combine being able to do serious academic research and real historical knowledge, and who have a journalistic background, who can write for ordinary readers. And I can clearly remember the fun we had when Richard was doing his biography of Richard Hatfield. It was when Richard was still alive. Richard Hatfield. This Richard's still alive, even now. But when Richard Hatfield was still alive. So it was kind of one of those things where you think, oh, like, well, what are we going to be able to talk about? What can't we talk about? But I think Richard and I shared the same view that Richard Hatfield was a very interesting, very, in many ways, very progressive politician and somebody who really did a lot of great things. And he wasn't recognized. You know, his achievements weren't, you know, were submerged by the media reputation that he got and the way the media treated him. And so I was really happy to work on that book. So I was delighted when Richard came along and proposed to do a book on Nova Scotia energy policy. Again, a subject where you think, wow, we all know that there are really interesting things about that subject, but how do you find out about them? You know, how can you get the picture? How can you see what the historical background is? It's that we operate in such a sort of a kind of a vague morass of there's some academic work and then there's the newspapers, but there's not much in between when it comes to Nova Scotia. And Richard can do that, and he did it. And I thought it was, the book got very little response, but it's still a really interesting book. And for anybody who cares about the subjects that he's dealing with, you know, it's very illuminating. So I wasn't totally enamored of the idea of trying to sell a book to Canada about equalization. I figured if there's a subject that belongs to the political class that nobody else knows or cares about, it would have to be that. When I was a child, my father was a bureaucrat in Manitoba. He didn't like me to call him that, but he was a bureaucrat in Manitoba. And I can remember even as a child, as a teenager, you know, in earnest discussions between my father and mother about questions about how Manitoba got money from Ottawa, what money they were getting, what money, he was the Deputy Minister of Education, so that was a big growth. It was like health today, right? It was a big expanding thing. So, you know, I kind of had this, that was the extent of my background, really, when it came to knowing anything about equalization. But I did think that it's so the attack from the think tanks on on any intervention, on sort of on the non-market activities of the government is so powerful. And there's so much of that around. I thought if Richard is prepared to spend his time and to actually get to, you know, write about this subject and to do it, I know he's going to do it from a historical point of view. I know that there'll be people in it, which is from a public policy point of view, you know, public policy books that only have public policy in them, nobody reads. Whereas at least with books of this kind where there's history, there are characters, and so there are people that you can see and identify with and learn about. I thought this sounded very promising. So, and I was delighted with the manuscript that we got. And for this event, I thought I'd better read what we finally published, because normally you only get to read it once. So I went back and read what the final words were, and you know, to me, I think it's a great, does a great job of opening up the subject from the political class, from the insiders, from the bureaucrats and the politicians, and I don't think there are that many journalists who really understand the subject or have background in it, to everybody else. And that's why I'm really glad to have heard Wendy say it's the kind of book that, you know, if you find yourself suddenly a politician and you're going to Ottawa and you're supposed to be knowledgeable about things, to have a book like this around to be able to turn to, I think is a great thing. So what's the job of a publisher? When people come along with great ideas, you do what you can to get them out there.
Great. So, equalization, I think you start out somewhere by saying it's unsexy, it's confusing, it's mind-numbing, but the logic is simple, And, I mean, I don't think any of us think that people will be quoting Section 36(2) of the Constitution anytime soon.
Well,
but
I think they ought to.
Maybe. But if we don't get people to do that, what should people take away from the book? I guess, how do we begin to have this conversation, which I think your book really is essential to the conversation that we need to be having. I mean, the way that you open your chapters is the way I begin every day reading the Chronicle Herald. I don't never read the comment pages, but many of your chapters is about some of that anger towards what you, I think, opened, which is what we hear in the Maritimes around we have an attitude problem, we need to pull up our bootstraps, but nobody really talks about the federal system and some of the root causes of the problems that we face today, which are not about attitude problems. Maybe I'll throw that to you. I mean, you talk about is the issue, is it that equalization isn't sexy? Is it that Canadian society has become less generous to others? Is it that people are just misinformed? Are people indifferent? How does your book help us to figure out?
Well, I think that looking at the history of it helps in that, for the first probably 50 or 60 years of Confederation, I don't think provinces pay too much attention to those kinds of things. I mean, there were occasional efforts to get a better deal out of Ottawa, but the problems started to crystallize in the 1930s, around the time of the Great Depression, and the notion started coming forward that there should be equality of citizenship in Canada, that the economic situation in Canada was such that there would always be some areas of Canada that were better off than other areas of Canada, and that the fact that geography or circumstance or a high tariff wall or oil and gas didn't put you in a privileged economic position should not mean that you would face a future of poorer services. And of course, for the first 60 or 70 years of Confederation, that's exactly what we had in the poorer provinces. I mean, the disparities in education, for example, and healthcare were huge. And the simple notion, it's not a hard idea. In fact, I start one of my chapters with a quote from Michael Ignatieff of all people, and in which he said that your public services shouldn't depend on your postal code. It's as simple as that. I could go on, but maybe Jim would like to pick it up there. But I mean, in terms of why it is that we think the way we do, I think we've been beaten down essentially. And I do think that the think tanks have had a role in this, and the media certainly had a role in this. When a politician from one of the, and the media use the term have-not, I don't use that term because everybody has something. But when a politician from that area raises it, that politician is accused of attacking that or posing a threat to national unity on the one hand, or whining on the other. And nobody wants to be seen as a whiner or a disruptor of national unity. So national unity tends to be equated with sort of going along with the status quo. And I point out several instances in the book, and particularly in more recent years with the Harper government, where the status quo essentially is Robin Hood in reverse, to use that somewhat trite expression. I mean, we have seen a federal transfer system change over the last 10 years, so that, and I've got the numbers here, I've got the mark, but the increases to the wealthier provinces like Alberta have been in the range of 156%. And Nova Scotia 36%. So we have listened to the propaganda to such an extent that nobody will even speak up about these kinds of developments. The Premier's Conference, called the Council of the Federation, a couple of years ago actually did speak up about it. They published a rather good report which pointed out those facts. In fact, I got those numbers, I believe, from the Council of Federation. Well, the Council of Federation met last week in Charlottetown, the cradle of Confederation, and they presented a report by Conference Board of Canada looking at the fiscal imbalance. It was something like 89 pages, and the only table in there comparing the provinces talked about their deficits in 2013, 2014. There was absolutely nothing in there to suggest that any province was better off than any other province. So our premiers have been put in a position now where they dare not whine about this situation. So I guess when I opened this and said, well, we should start talking about Section 36,
For the record,
subsections 1 and 2.
For the record, say what it is, Richard.
Well, I'll read it. I think I've got it here. Well, I'll ad-lib it. It's essentially if you've looked at the Canadian Constitution, the first 34 sections are the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 35 deals with Aboriginal rights. Section 36 deals with the services, or deals with the federal provincial fiscal relations. And Section 36 essentially says that all Canadians and all provincial governments agreed to this at the time in 1982, as did the federal government, that Canadians are entitled to a comparable level of public services at comparable rates of taxation. And the evidence in my book is not overwhelming. It's not a slam dunk because nobody even keeps track of this stuff, really.
Right. Yeah.
But I think there's plenty of evidence that, in fact, since the Constitution was adopted in 1982, we've been moving more or less in the opposite direction. That our political class has failed to live up to those aspects of the Constitution. So, as I was saying to my friend Robert earlier, maybe if he comes to my door during the election campaign, I'm going to ask him, how are you doing on Section 36, 1 and 2?
Okay. Fair enough.
And I'll have an answer.
Unlike the other guys who show up at my door.
But you do provide some fairly striking examples of the disparities that exist today. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to actually highlight some of those. I mean, I think as we talk about strategy, those are the kinds of things that will stick, is how it affects people's everyday lives. And I know we had this conversation. Mm-hmm. In terms of strategy, I think I gather from the book and from talking to you that you don't believe that Canadians are less generous, that perhaps Canadians are misinformed or not informed enough about this issue.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, the last time anybody looked at this issue was in the middle of the last decade, 2005, 2006, and the O'Brien Commission, as it was called, did do focus groups and surveys and so on, and they reported in their final report, which actually became an item of great contention amongst the different provinces, but they found quite a bit of support for not only comparable services, but a higher level of services, or an acceptable level of services, I think was the language. So I think that if you probe, if you ask people questions, they'll say, of course, people in Prince Edward Island shouldn't have public services that are inferior to people in Ontario, British Columbia. I think some people might say, well, Alberta's different, they got so much wealth, so perhaps people are prepared to cut Alberta a bit of slack in that regard, but no, I think there is some, there's probably a fair bit of goodwill amongst Canadians. I think the difficulty is they never get a chance to articulate it. We rarely talk about it. When this subject does come up, as I say, it's more like, the provinces are whining, the have-not provinces are complaining, that sort of thing, rather than having the issue framed as I would like to see it framed, is that, well, we're not doing very well in living up to the commitments that all governments made for comparable services at comparable rates of taxation.
My take on this is that this is a very unstable and volatile situation that's just bubbling away. And it's hard to know where the explosion's going to happen. And if I were to guess, I'd guess that it would be somewhere in the area of healthcare, because there is an idea that people should be able to get more or less the same kind of healthcare no matter where you are in Canada. and and so it could easily be, there's sort of like a crucial incident where suddenly some person who's very politically appealing, or some story that the media happen to bump into, where it's kind of like, and there have been ones like this, like people who move from the Maritimes to Alberta for autistic children treatment because they have a very good program around autistic children in Alberta, but it hasn't come to crystallize the awareness of the huge differences that exist right now in the levels of service that people can experience. I mean, my personal experience of living half the time here and half the time in Toronto is really startling in this respect. Just when you're encountering the normal, ordinary, things about the way the healthcare system works here versus there, and that's not an extreme. I'm not faced with any extreme situation or anything that would be really, but I'm sure that, to me, it's in healthcare where there would be a sense that if you're a 9-year-old child, there's no reason why, it isn't fair, it isn't right that there should be such disparities. The other way that it could happen, which I was amazed by, and that Richard has great stats on this in his book, is, there's a table, for example, where he talks about a family, of earning $75,000, which is, let's say, a moderate average income type family, where they're paying provincial taxes in Alberta of $2,900, and almost in Nova Scotia it's $7,300. That's the total tax bill. Well, there's a certain if you're earning $75,000 a year, $5,000 is a lot of money. And so people in Nova Scotia right today, are paying, and in other provinces too, the difference between what people are paying. Yes, there's service different, and then there's the fact that the taxation levels vary so much. So I just think this is one of those things that you can't predict, you can't control, but sooner or later, and hopefully it would be sooner, there would be some event, some crystallizing event where people wake up and say, hey, this doesn't seem fair. And that's the context in which a national political party might dare to take this on, because obviously they're scared right now, totally frightened away from talking in a meaningful way about this, and very prone to lapse into the language that nobody really cares about, the sort of the bureaucratic, the language of services and social service, just things that don't mean things to people in the same way that concrete examples and specifics like care for an autistic kid people do connect to things like that.
And that was striking. I don't know what page that's on, but do you remember the difference? Alberta was $30,000 per child for autistic services and $3 for New Brunswick, so like 300. Where's we should really find a number. I mean, there are striking examples of the disparities that exist. I mean, you can look at wait times is the other one that you look at. But the other point I think you make loud and clear are also the differences in need, which is I think where you end up in saying what are some of the solutions. We really need to be taking into consideration demographics, age and health status, socioeconomic status when we're looking at all of the issues around funding. I think it might be.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll just quote from here. A survey by the Library of Parliament in 2006 found the proverbial patchwork of service this is for children with autism. Alberta offered more than $40,000 per child annually for treatment, generating media reports about families moving from other provinces, especially Saskatchewan, to take advantage. Ontario was spending $113 million on services, about $10 per capita, while the other extreme, PEI and New Brunswick, were spending about $3 per capita. So actually, it's an apples and oranges comparison, but the per capita, there was that variation in per capita spending between the provinces on that.
Which I think raises another issue you make about reframing this discussion and how we might win over those who haven't been wanting to talk about the less wealthy. And that is, if we continue down this road, there's here and there parts of this argument that can be made about equalization being economically efficient. and if we continue down the road we're on, how economically inefficient it is. I wonder if you would talk about that. So in trying to think about
Well,
strategy and reframing.
Jim went to LSE, so he would know
Oh,
more
well,
about that.
then
And I see
Jim.
Lars Osberg back there, who
Yes, I
knows
saw.
more about it than I do. But just in general, I mean, that was one of the things that the Roll-Sirwa commissioners noted, that they said to the wealthier provinces, you know, if you don't want a bunch of unemployed, uneducated, unhealthy maritimers showing up, you better buy into this program that will provide them with education, healthcare, and jobs where they are now. And so perhaps if you know, the wealthier provinces suddenly find people jumping the queue ahead of them to get healthcare services, they may start realizing that yes, indeed, there is some benefit to us for aside from altruism. There is some actual. It is in our self-interest to fund this kind of system. I also quote in the book, and Lars noted this many years ago in a report that he did for I think the Ontario government, but more recently a commentator in the Globe and Mail. I mean, talked about the billions of dollars that the poorer provinces have spent educating their young people, so that they can provide an educated workforce for the industries of Alberta. We kind of bemoan that fact, but if indeed we are not overtaxing ourselves in order to educate those young people, why not? The system would probably balance out. But if we're overtaxing ourselves in order to provide that service, and then our young people are going off to Alberta, then we do have to ask whether it's a fair situation.
Did you?
I just one thing. I think that fairness could easily be the thing that really triggers people generally. This, you know, the idea that what's going on right now is fundamentally unfair. I think that connects in a way that a lot of other ideas are too big, too abstract, too confusing, whatever. But there is a fundamental unfairness that's emerged. And so it's just how that gets to the point where people say, yeah, you're right, it is unfair. And in fact, when I was reading the published version of Richard's book, as people will see when they read it themselves, like there's all kinds of, there are all kinds of times that this theme comes back when he's describing the history of these ideas, that fairness, the fairness idea is right at the heart of something. And to talk about equalization, I'm asleep. But to talk about fairness, I do think that it's true that think tanks accept it, neoliberals accept it. The fundamental fairness that should make things fair for Canadians everywhere. I think that people very strongly relate to that. And it's one of the great gifts of Harperism that they've been able to bury this and put it away and hide it and prevent people from really, seeing that kind of aspect to the situation.
I think on that score, I know that I've gotten a rise out of people on this subject when I talk about, as I do in one or two of the chapters, the move towards equal per capita funding in healthcare. Now that is a very arcane subject, but what it amounts to is that for years, federal funding of healthcare took into account the fact that back in the mid-70s, the feds transferred a certain number of tax points to the provinces. And of course, these tax points varied in value from one province to the other, so that the tax points transferred to Ontario or to Alberta or to British Columbia were worth a whole lot more than the tax points sent to Nova Scotia. Well, this thing was attacked from two different directions. It was attacked, first of all, from the point of view that it was not fair that Alberta and Ontario and British Columbia should get less cash from the federal government. In other words, disregard the tax points. And, I guess that's an element of unfairness there. But they were also attacked from the other perspective, which was the poorer provinces shouldn't get extra equalization because their tax points were not up to the national average. So we lost both of those things. We lost the equalized portion of our tax points, and the richer provinces got equal cash. And the result of that this year, of that program, was that Alberta's health transfer went up 37.6% year over year. Nova Scotia's went up 2%. And the highest...
They need the money, Richard.
Well,
they
yeah.
need the money. They
And
don't
the-
tax their public. Well,
and
so
the-
with it.
the only other province that came even close to Alberta was Saskatchewan at 4%. So there was that huge discrepancy. I think it got maybe a bit of coverage in the Chronicle Herald, but anybody that I've mentioned it to has been like, what? How did that happen? So I think there are, even when there's unfairness in the system, it's rarely profiled. We rarely find out about it.
And that's the
when
$1 billion, yes?
Yes, it's $1 billion.
Yeah, we need to say that.
Okay. Well, 37
Alberta
versus
got
4 is pretty easy
$1
too, I
billion
think.
more.
Yeah, but because of a formula change that was wrong-headed in the first place. I mean, it was essentially amnesiac. They decided we're going to forget about the fact that the tax points that we transferred back in 1977 had different value depending on which province they went to. So I guess the fact that there was no galvanizing opinion around that was a little bit disappointing. In fact, I know that because I read the Hansard on it, I know that when it was raised in the House of Commons by my Member of Parliament, Mr. Chisholm over there, Jason Kenney went after him and said, you know, you're not being fair to Albertans by raising this issue.
Because it's not fair.
It's not fair, but they have a completely different definition of fairness than I do.
So the perversity. I mean, the challenge of, and that you talk about all of the ways that this dominant discourse has created this huge wall, and how it's been taken in the Maritimes itself. And you talked about that. The new vision being self-help and self-flagellation.
And self-immolation.
Right. That, you know, there's this moral, virtuous underpinning thing.
Well, and I don't know how much of that is lip service to the folks up along, and how much people really believe that. Because Frank McKenna is a perfect example of that. I mean, he went up to Ontario and he talked about dependency in the Maritimes and what a terrible thing that was. But when he was faced with the EI cuts,
Right.
he rose to the occasion and was quite influential in reducing the impact of the EI cuts under the Liberals. The fact that the horse had already left the barn under the Conservatives was a problem, but those cuts would have been worse without McKenna's intervention. So if he'd actually, I suppose if he actually believed some of that stuff that he was, you know, saying to the folks of Ontario and to the national media, he might not have been as effective. So I wonder if we really have absorbed that stuff, or we're just sort of saying, well, you gotta say that kind of stuff to get along. If you actually start talking seriously about those kind of disparities, you'll be accused of disrupting national unity or challenging national unity, which of course nobody wants to do, even me.
I'm going to end with the last question, which is to go back to, so where do we go? What do we do with the information in this book? I mean, there's some really fantastic information here, some really great ideas around solutions. Actually, the one that I think may be one of the cracks is the carbon tax idea and climate change. I wonder if you'd talk about that. And any of the other solutions that you propose as a way of, okay, what can we put on the table to fix the problems?
Well, I come back to my sort of all-purpose solution, which is to try to change the frame so that the conversation is different. That the conversation is not about makers versus takers. The conversation is about equal citizenship and how our politicians are achieving that. If we can change that discussion, there's all kinds of things that can be done to redistribute some of the wealth from the better off taxpayers. I won't say provinces, because it doesn't go from province to province. It goes from taxpayers to provinces, and the taxpayers are included, the taxpayers in Nova Scotia who contribute to equalization. if you can change that frame, then, as I say, there are all kinds of solutions. The carbon tax has in fact been proposed by the Mowat Centre, which is hardly a friend of Atlantic Canada, and by Thomas Corshane, who's probably the most knowledgeable economist in the country, political scientist, I guess he is, in the country on equalization. So it's not exactly a radical idea. It's more a matter of convincing politicians that it's something they need to deal with. You know, I mean, we're going to have a federal election in a year. We know where the current government is going. They are going to balance their budget and they're going to cut some more taxes. That's the plan. I would like to know what the plan for the other parties is, and I would preface my question to them with Section 36(2), however you want to translate it, with that question in the forefront. And the solutions will follow from there. Some will be better than others, and some will be more politically palatable than others.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say here is that however this discussion gets to another level, and whenever that happens, it's there. The great thing about Richard's book is that he's made it possible, if people choose, to actually get their minds around this. And who knows when and that'll happen, and who knows if it'll happen, but could. At least it's possible now. Whereas without that kind of research, without that kind of understanding, you know, it's just sort of one of those things that it's out there, but you don't really know. So I think that's, and it won't surprise me, just to repeat what I was saying, that it doesn't come down to people saying this is not fair. We need to have, you know, if Canada means being that we treat each other equally, that we have equal access. Like we put in the cover note, we talked about how the fact that you don't expect that your Canada pension plan is going to vary depending on what province you live in. So why is it that our health care varies so much? You know, and why is it that you can get the same thing or almost the same, or more, you know, in Alberta or compared to other provinces? By paying, you know, you can get more and pay less. These things just don't add up. So how and when it happens, but fairness and the idea that we are all Canadians, we all should have an equal level of reasonably equal thing. And as we were talking when we talked about this before, I think it's great that it's in the Constitution, and it won't. I don't think we would be surprised. I don't think any of us should be surprised that there's going to be a key decision about this by the Supreme Court of Canada. But it's going to be after the political climate has changed, and so after Canada is saying, just a second, Canadians are saying, you know, that we believe in equalization, and it's right in our Constitution. So that means governments have to act differently. But that's it. That's the Supreme Court would only make it real when the climate of opinion around makes it necessary for it to be real. In the same way that, you know, that their decisions around abortion and their decisions around sexual orientation only happened when, you know, when the bigger community wanted it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at all the people sitting here, and those of you that I know, and I'm thinking, gosh, I mean, there are people here who know way more about this than me. There are people here who've been engaged with this for years. There are people who've done research in this for long periods of time. And I'm really anxious to hear what feedback people have for Richard and for these ideas.
Yes. On that note, let's open it up.
He went to LSE, ask him.
So, what do people think? How can we ensure that all Canadians, no matter which province they live in, receive the same opportunities and benefits from their government? Essentially what this book is about. Okay.
I think you actually just pointed to one of the challenges that I think any sort of movement around this is going to face, and it's the discourse of equality of opportunities. That is a notion of fairness that is in operation in neoliberal and liberal thinking. That it's enough that people have just the basic opportunities to then be entrepreneurial and enterprising and, you know, bring you know, various forms of prosperity to their province. It's the kind of thinking that's in operation in the evolution
As opposed to like the quality of outcomes.
Yeah, and because it's so much more, it's more difficult to measure quality of opportunity than quality of outcomes in many ways. So it's harder to get it across to people that, know there are historical and very durable reasons why there is inequality that need to be, mitigated by some, a system that has, equations working out why various provinces get different amounts.
And I guess there's two parts to that, and certainly even the neoconservatives have acknowledged that it's okay to provide equalization so that people can get better educated and be able to, what you're talking about, take advantage of opportunities. Sorry. The other part of it is that regional development was supposed to be a tool for doing that. And as we know in the Maritimes, we've made a great sport of saying how terrible regional development has been and giving money away to fly-by-night companies and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that has happened. But on the other hand, we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot when it comes to regional development. There is virtually none now. And as I note in the book, we sort of reached I think we kind of reached the nadir of that whole thing when downtown Toronto got designated as a have-not regional development area. So I agree, and I think that is covered in Section 36(1) and 2. And that kind of framing would probably appeal to people.
Interesting the last day or so, the reaction from Upalong to the decision by his government to impose to extend or legislate a moratorium on fracking. It's like, how dare we? Here we are, Nova Scotians, no money, got our hands out to the other provinces, right? And we're not going to, we're not prepared at this moment to pound unknown chemicals into the ground in order to produce something, oil of some kind or natural gas, right? I mean, the tone of the response I thought was really insightful. How dare we? I mean, that coming from the Andrew Coynes and others, that was quite telling in terms of how to get some of this issue of fairness and balance into that.
Well, yeah, I think, one way of addressing that kind of thing is to, either you, I shouldn't say believe, either you hold that, climate change is a huge environmental issue that we need to deal with, and the only way to deal with it, according to most people who've looked at it, is leave about 2/3 of the fossil fuels that are there in the ground. Maybe we should get more equalization payments because we left that stuff in the ground rather than, so it's that, it's the allegiance between the right wing and the climate change. It's all of a piece. That's what you would kind of expect from those guys. I think that it might have been politically smarter to hold off on that fracking moratorium and kind of talked about different kinds of jobs, rather than just saying, oh, we're not going to do it. Particularly given the current state of employment and job creation in Nova Scotia, which is not great. But, so it probably could have been handled a little better.
But I was talking more about the tone. It's like, how dare we?
Right, it's our responsibility to develop those resources so we can get off equalization.
Or whatever.
Right, yeah, or whatever,
However.
Yeah, maybe right now we have one LNG plant that's going to set up in Nova Scotia. There's lots of room out there. There's nothing in Guysborough County. Let's have 7 or 8 LNG plants out there, and really get off equalization. And while we're at it, let's just wreck the environment some more.
Sorry, Brian.
I was thrilled last fall when I heard you were preparing this book, and then a few weeks later, I was really sorry that it wasn't coming out before now, because the Fraser Institute, as you may recall, issued a report that
I'm not sure that the Fraser Institute's going to study it. So I think it's up to you folks to use what parts of it are useful in order to do that responding.
Okay, question in the back, and then
Well, I'd just like to
a comment.
pick up on this question of fairness, which I think is crucial to the discussion. And it seems to me that one of the obstacles is we need to really change the nature and the tone of the conversation about fairness, in the sense that there are many people associated with the political right, but not exclusively the political right, who believe firmly that it's perfectly fair for the Maritimes to have lower rates of services, because the Maritimes don't help themselves, because Maritimes are lethargic. They want to preserve these picturesque little communities, and they want other Canadians to support them for doing so. And it seems to me that one of the ways of changing that conversation is to underline the way in which Maritimers for 100 years have been both individually and collectively among the most resilient of Canadians. Unfortunately, for the kind of issues that Richard's book is talking about, one of the chief methods of resilience is to leave. On the one hand, Maritimers are criticized for saying, "Oh, you're lethargic, you want to stay with your lighthouse, stay by the sea in your little community." But the reality is that young people have been pulling up for many generations, and they go where the employment is. But that leaves the rest of us with a population that is aging, with rural decline, where rural services become impossible to deliver. And so, even though rural communities are highly entrepreneurial, you have to drive through rural areas to see the computer repair, the beauty salons, whatever, business of every kind. Nevertheless, that cycle is such that in a way, it makes it easy for people who are ideologically committed to the idea that Maritimers are unproductive to make that case. Somehow, having to make the fairness argument stick, that has to be addressed and combated.
Well, I think there's a self-interest argument there as well, which I talked about in the book, which is, and again, Lars has dealt with this in the past, and the idea that out of our small communities emerge well-educated people who do move, who are resilient, who are resourceful, who move to other provinces and help keep things going. The people who stay behind, keep the community going, so that all these people can move back when they're, we are part of a country, and our kids, we may raise our kids here, and then someday our kids are going to come back, but it all comes down to having those kinds of community supporting services available to the folks up along who are paying, the higher tax rates or whatever. But it's to their self-interest that we are here in order to, would they prefer to have, some kind of, bombed out slum down here, or those picturesque communities that they criticize, they can move to them anytime if they want. And many of them are, in fact.
So there's a table in the book that I just glanced at that talks about out-migration, and in one section there's actually an uptick in Nova Scotia in 71 to 76. And now there's a lot of talk about immigration being a solution to helping our economic development. And the quotas that have been imposed by Ottawa on immigration, I wonder if you relate that to equalization in any way, or the thinking behind equalization. There's any connection?
Well, I think that uptick, the theory on the uptick was that the EI system improved greatly in 1971, and the uptick followed. And I think there's been some academic research that supports that notion. Not a whole lot, but so that may have had an impact in stemming the out-migration of young people. If, for example, they could get a job at the fish plant and then get 10, 12 weeks work and then stay in their community rather than moving on to Toronto, which was the destination. No, Alberta was also the destination at that time. but I don't. That had nothing to do. It had nothing to do with immigration per se. I don't think. I think our immigration levels were very low back then. It was just some decrease in out migration.
Do you think that there's, so in the conservative or right-wing side, thinking that immigration is going to be a solution, that people will be coming in there, there's a sentiment behind that, that'll help with giving us more economic advantage, we need less equalization,
Well, if we got more people, we'd actually get more equalization unless they brought a lot of fiscal capacity with them, right? And we would also get more health and, because those are all based on per capita kind of things. So I think it would probably be a healthy thing for Nova Scotia if we had more citizens, and we would get more money out of the feds, I believe. Now, whether there would be a net bottom line gain, I don't know. It would depend on the services and the income levels and all that sort of thing. But per capita picture would improve.
One last.
Jim mentioned before that this is likely to continue unless there's a groundswell and there's a breaking point, and that it might result in a Supreme Court decision or a challenge. Given that you've mentioned healthcare and education, which are primarily provincially delivered, is there a sort of sense that if there was a Supreme Court upholding of 36, that the provinces might offer notwithstanding? Are they the ones that will be the blocks, or is it the federal government that's the problem?
Well, I didn't explore this. I mean, the whole idea of the Supreme Court, or any court becoming involved, was kind of dismissed early on by a constitutional expert from University of Toronto or someplace, and I don't think it's been pursued. It would have to come from citizens, as far as I know, because all the governments signed on to it. So I don't know that one government could sue the other guys for not living up to the terms of Section 36.2. I think it would have to be almost like a class action or something along those lines. I don't know.
And I wasn't mentioning it as something that I think is a real, that's they're the immediate things that could happen. I just see that as being something that's there, that at a certain point could be relevant. In the same way, it wasn't that the Supreme Court invented laws that they used to decide, about sexual orientation. It was more a shifting in the social context, where then the kinds of people who sit around the table there sort of were looking at things differently. And in a way, the great thing about it being in the Constitution is that it's at the right moment. That's a pretty important. Well, think of it the other way. If it wasn't there, what the discussion would have to be. So it does show. It crystallizes. It demonstrates the point that Richard's making, that this isn't just the plea of the poor regions, or the sort of the policy thinkers on behalf of the smallest provinces trying to figure out a rationale for why they should be in a better economic position. This is a bigger idea that, as Richard's saying, is everybody bought into, and I do think it's it's funny, in the world of books you're always riding several different hobby horses all at once. One of my other hobby horses is I've got an author who's done a book that's really got a lot to say about the think tanks and the role of the think tanks with Harper, and it's just coming out, and to see the way that it's slowly but sure, it's our friends. The author is Donald Gutstein, and we both did research on land development in the 1970s. He in Vancouver, me in Toronto, and our friends in the land development business have a lot to do with getting the Fraser Institute. It's kind of Vancouver, starting it off, and there's some people in the States who were setting up these kinds of right-wing think tanks in other countries, not just Canada, and certainly not just in the States. But anyway, they've been working away with a very clear plan to change the climate of opinion, to change the way that people think. And as Donald would argue, and did in his previous book, they've been hugely successful in Canada. Not, my view would be, not with ordinary people who don't worry about big policy type, the economic theory is not something, believing that the market's going to solve all problems is not something that an ordinary person is going to fall prey to. You have to be very educated to have an idea like that, is my view. But the bigger thing is that they've created a climate of opinion in which it's way tougher now to make to make the case for equalization than was the case in the 1980s. That doesn't mean it can't be done, though. And my point was that it's something. The situation's getting more and more extreme. I actually think that the fiscal circumstances facing the Maritimes and the way that the projections look, if it's bad now, I really do believe that the chances of it being worse look awfully high. And it's like in the 30s. There's a real crisis in Canada around the impoverishment of provinces that were basically bankrupt. And it's not hard to see how that you just don't know when suddenly the things that are intolerable are going to become a crisis. And when they are, to have on the table another view of Canada, a view of Canada where yes, if you're, it doesn't matter whether you're in Truro or you're in Temagami, the level of healthcare that you should be able to access you should, for the same amount of money, basically be able to get the same kind of thing. And if you're sitting in Alberta, it shouldn't be that you are able to get all these things for paying way less. I think that people will connect, but how it all unfolds, who knows? The great thing, though, is that there's something sitting there, as opposed to all the think tank stuff, and and all the academic things, which I'm amazed that Richard could even read, because most of it is unreadable, right, in these kinds of subjects. So he's done the work of reading it. He's got a little bit enmeshed in the language, because he can talk the language, as you've seen tonight, a little bit. But when you read his book, you can see that he can pull away from that and talk about these things in words that we can all easily understand. And I think that's a great gift to have it there. And the moment will come when everybody will say, wow, this is something we are going to have to do something about.
Okay, this is the last one.
Two comments. But in the 70s, part of my work was closely studying the federal provincial fiscal discussions and arrangements a lot. And I read an OECD study of all of its member countries, looking at why did some countries actually equalize and others not, which I thought was an amazing, great little work. This is one of their usual slim volumes. And the answer they came up with was that countries that had significant language or religious differences within the country, where there were political divisions based around language and religion, did not equalize fairly, whereas those that had great economic disparity did equalize, which goes to the point that this excellent book, and we here tonight are looking at this from this side of Quebec. Historically, and even on the prairies, I'm sure it's the case in BC still, from the other side of Quebec, the great issue on equalization is, in fact, Quebec, not the Maritimes. And the fact that Quebec is the major recipient of equalization, the province that is different, that is a nation within the country, is a major factor behind, I think, much of what's happened in Canada all through, because there's a limit to what people are willing to do that it would cross those historic, they were religious and language and cultural barriers, and still are essentially real barriers there. And Quebec, of course, sees itself as being so distinct as a society, which is a major barrier, in fact, to equalization. The title is created equal as citizens. The way I think people most got around this, and you suggested this earlier in the discussion, was focusing not on the fiscal arrangements, but on the reality of citizens. And it was when the federal government took on the task of educational opportunity, took on the task of establishing Medicare, which were in fact two Diefenbaker initiatives that Pearson picked up. Then you had something different, because then people saw the federal government doing something that was going to give them all the same kind of equal service. And in both cases, people saw a great need for something to be done. They were thinking back to those days, they were paying for private health care, and they had tremendous inequality on health care. It's hard to cast our minds back. My mother saved the hospital bill from my birth, for example, which was starting to think these days, see how much it cost to be born. But that was being addressed, and also the demand for higher education that people couldn't afford were both being addressed. The question for any national political party now is what service for people is in such demand in so many parts of the country that calling for a federal program, a federal initiative to ensure it is popular enough to become a unifying factor, I think, as opposed to a divisive factor. And that's a real question. It is hindered by the fact that the Martin healthcare money eased the worst concerns in healthcare, and of course there's a lack of awareness. There's no national coverage of disparity. In fact, and even disparities, because some of the disparities are within provinces too, of course.
Okay.
But anyway, I know I've been on. Those are points that I think spark the discussion to think about on the solution side of this.
Okay. Very good. Would you like to add a chapter on that, Dan? Second edition?
Yes.
Do you want
Folks, I want to suggest that we continue our conversations over beer and wine and some lovely refreshments and nibblies that have been provided through the kind sponsorship of CCPA. And there's going to be books for sale over here. And I don't think we're going to solve all of these issues tonight, but I think we've taken a really good first look at framing this conversation in a different way. And thank you for coming. And